We've gotten relief. That means the work permit and status here in the United States, immigration papers for our clients when they were mistreated by an employer. I'm going to tell you how we did it. I'm U.S. immigration attorney, and I share immigration information that can empower you to get to the green card. Did an employer underpay you, overwork you, mistreat you, pay you late? If this is the case, you should know that they're not allowed to do this, even if you don't have your immigration papers. And how do I know this? I know this because I've gotten relief for my clients when they have experienced this. I am also going by what is in the USCIS policy manual about the relief that certain individuals can get if they experience this kind of mistreatment by an employer. For example, I'm going to give you a case study, one of our cases that we won and got our client T status. Our client came to the United States on a visitor's visa, but while they were here, an employer came with an irresistible offer. The employer, who ran a construction company, told my client that they could get them the green card if they came and worked for them. Now, I have a tip to tell you, and you may not have known this previously, but you should always ask for papers first and then work for them afterwards. It's not the other way around. You don't work for them and then they get the papers. That's not even allowed. And to continue, our client was thrilled about this offer. Imagine an employer is going to make life better for him and his family by applying for his green card. Of course, he accepted the job. And in many cases, immigrants don't understand how unscrupulous some employers can be to take full advantage of immigrants here and their desire to get papers. He requested a status update on what was going on with his papers, the green card that the employer promised him. The employer stalled and stalled and stalled and stalled until my client injured themselves and was unable to work. This was devastating to my client. But in that time when my client was injured, they realized that this employer didn't really care about their well-being and they were not filing any papers. This was about 9 months into working this hard job where my client was ultimately injured. This was very traumatic for my client because he trusted the employer. My client had to start all over again, but by this point, he had overstayed his visa, he did not have his papers here, and he was lost. Thankfully, we helped him, and as a result of what the employer did, a broken promise, a false promise, we were able to get our client the T status. Now my client and his family will be reunited in the United States to get the relief that he deserved. The USCIS states very clearly that this is labor trafficking. So labor trafficking in this case happens when one is recruited by the employer and subjected to involuntary servitude. That's servitude, that is work that they would have never agreed to do. And this employer did this, subjected to them to this kind of involuntary servitude. That means work that they would have never been willing to do, based on fraud, coercion, or force. Now here, in this particular case, it involved fraud. That is where the employer gave false promises to induce our client to work for them. My client had stated very clearly he would have never agreed to the kind of work that he was doing had he known that this is the situation he would have been in, that there would have been no green card at the end of it all. What I just talked about was an example of labor trafficking by fraud, but there is also coercion, which is very extensive. I'm going to explain what coercion is and how it can lead one to be forced into involuntary servitude. Coercion under the USCIS policy manual is defined very broadly. I'm going to simplify it for you in a way that's very clear. So first, coercion can fall into 3 different categories that is stated in the USCIS policy manual. Coercion can be threats of serious harm. Coercion can be a plan, a scheme, a pattern that's carried out by the employer that forces the immigrant to be in a situation that they feel trapped in, or they feel like they are going to experience some form of harm. And that harm doesn't have to be physical harm. It could be other types of harm that they fear. It could be reputational harm. It could be emotional harm as well. Coercion is also abuse or threatened abuse of the legal process. I'll narrow this down even further for you. Here are some examples of threats of serious harm. Now, keep in mind that this list isn't exclusive, but it gives you a very good idea of what constitutes threats of serious harm. It could involve threats to family members or third parties. It could mean if you don't comply with the employer's demands, they could then banish you, subject you to starvation, deprive you of food, or deprive you of the money and finances that you need to be able to sustain yourself and your family. It could mean subjecting you to isolation, sleep deprivation. For example, I've had clients who are required to work 24/7, and because of that, they're sleep deprived. That is a denial of sleep, where they force them to work so much they can't even take a rest. They may deduct your pay if you're late. They may deprive you of a whole day's worth of work if you are late for work. So they implement certain types of punishments that are meant to teach you a lesson so that you continue to comply with their demands and you don't question their processes. Withholding pay. So I've had clients that are paid late. They're not paid on time. That is a form of withholding pay. Also, if they take a portion of your pay or take deductions, that can qualify as withholding of pay, and it is a threat of serious harm. If they also use it as a tactic where if you don't comply with what they want, they withhold your pay, that is also a threat of serious harm. If the employer threatens immigration, whether directly or indirectly, then that also qualifies as serious harm. For example, if the employer indirectly implies that they have family members or links in the immigration service and they can use those connections to get you deported or to report you, that is an implied threat of serious harm. They straight up threaten to deport you. Also, threatening your reputation, threatening to blacklist you is also a threat of serious harm. So as you can see, not all of these threats of serious harm means that there's some kind of physical violence there to get you to comply. Some of these can be non-verbal, some of them can be indirect threats as well. Let's talk about the scheme, pattern, or plan of the employer who is trying to get you to comply with them, to do the work that you would have never willingly complied with had you known what you were getting into. The list is also expansive here as well. If the employer is using these tactics, this plan, the scheme or pattern to get you to stay in this situation, then it's time to explore your options for the T status. Keep in mind that you don't have to be working for the employer. This could have happened years ago, and you would still be able to qualify for this. Here are some examples of a scheme, pattern, or plan by an employer to keep certain employees compliant with them. This is not allowed, and this is also leads to labor trafficking. If they take your documents, like your identification documents, your passport, they may want to hold on to it, or they take it and make copies of it and make it very clear that they have made copies of it so that they can track you. They can use those documents against you by submitting it to immigration. If you know of a time when the employer tried to obstruct you from getting certain public benefits and services that would have helped you to escape the situation, or that would have brought relief to better the situation that you were in, this is also an example of a plan, scheme, or pattern put in place to make you feel as if there is no escape and that you have to remain in the situation that you're in. If culturally or linguistically, as in you're not speaking the language, they are able to isolate you, then that is also a part of the plan, pattern, or scheme put in place to stop you from seeking the assistance that you need or communication with people around you that are able to help you. It's a way to make you feel as if you don't have the power to escape. If you were placed in a situation where you faced harsh working and living conditions, then this can also be a part of the plan, scheme, or pattern to keep you compliant with the employer. For example, you may be placed in overcrowded housing and still forced to pay rent out of the wages. This rent could have been drawn from your wages, and after that expense is pulled, you have nothing or very little to go off of. That, once again, is meant to keep you compliant and prevent you from escaping the situation. Workplace intimidation is a part of this plan, scheme, or pattern. You're being yelled at. If you're being intimidated, if they're throwing things and making you feel as if they could be capable of even physical violence, that's once again meant to keep you compliant, keep you in your place, keep you from asking questions, and keeping you stuck and trapped in that situation in fear of bad consequences if you stand up. Now, some of the most common plan schemes and patterns that I've seen in my clients is regarding payment of wages. For one, the employer usually subjects my clients to a high debt that they have to pay. They may have to pay taxes, they may have to pay for housing, they may have to pay for another staff member to work, they may have to provide their tips to the employer at the end of the day. If something breaks, they have to pay for it. If something is lost, they have to pay for it. This is the kind of artificial debt that the employer creates that reduces the wages of my clients and disempowers them. As a result, they have to keep working to get that money to pay back what they owe the employer. At a minimum, they have to keep working to at least have enough after the debt to be able to sustain themselves and their family. As I stated before, fraud is very prevalent. And so you may have a situation where you're lured into working for the employer with the promise of housing, of food, coverage of food, and certain work conditions. But when you get there, none of that is there. You're working 5 or 6 positions when you're really just supposed to work for one position that you are hired for. You are living in infested housing. Sometimes you're not even provided the housing. You're sleeping on a couch without privacy. That is fraud here and can be a part of a large pattern, scheme, and plan of the employer to lure you into that situation and force you into a helpless situation where you're unable to escape at that point. Have you ever been in a situation where you worked for the employer and you felt like you were worse off than before? You felt as if you just could not keep up financially because of the way that the employer structured the employment. That means you're constantly feeling like you're trying to keep up with your expenses, with your debts, but you're unable to. And that may be because of the conditions that the employer created to make you feel this way. For example, if the employer is underpaying you, not paying you the wages that were promised, they're overworking you, giving you 5, 6, 7 positions to work in when you're really being paid for one position. They're not giving you the hours that you were promised. So you're not working enough hours. You find that you're working 20 hours a week when you were promised 40 hours a week. But at the same time, you're still required to be at the employer's disposal when they need you to be. They're also taking deductions from your payments that you did not agree to or you did not know about. For example, undocumented workers, sometimes they tell me that employers are pulling taxes, but how are they paying taxes when they haven't given the employer a social security number or an ITIN to report these payment of taxes to the IRS? That means that those taxes are going straight into the pockets of the employers, and it is in no way going to the IRS to meet any kind of tax requirements. You may be afraid to leave the situation because of another tactic used by the employer. The employer may be stating that they have all these links to law enforcement and to ICE and to immigration service. And of course, if you're without your papers, or you even have your papers, but you want to make sure you're complying with immigration laws, it puts you in fear of speaking up against the employer. They also may threaten to blacklist you. That means they threaten reputational harm. And this is maybe a pattern that's direct, where they say it directly to you, or it may be indirect. It may be implied by what they do. For example, you may have witnessed them fire other employees who stood up for themselves. And when they fired them, they threatened to call immigration or threatened to call police on them. That is not a direct threat to you, but indirectly that employer does it in front of you, and you know they're very capable of doing the same thing to you. Now, the last example of threats of serious harm is abuse of legal process. We won a case for our client where this threat of legal process was used by a supervisor. Now, our client was working very hard in this job, and the conditions were terrible. They were forced to go into a freezer without protective gear, and as a result of that, they fell ill. When my client went to the supervisor and told the supervisor that they need to take rest and they need some time off, the supervisor told my client that they must present a doctor's letter to be able to get time off. This is an example of abuse of legal process because the supervisor fraudulently made it look as if a doctor's letter is legally required in order for them to grant my client a day off. As a result of that, it forced my client to continue working under conditions that he did not willingly want to work in. That equals involuntary servitude. Other examples of abuse or threats of abuse of legal process are if they tell you that if you leave the job, you'll get into trouble, or that based on their connections, they can call immigration on a whim to get you deported. And even in cases where you have your H-1B, you have your H-2B, you have your H-1A visas, or you have your J-1, and the employer makes it look as if you make the choice to leave the situation, that they can get you blacklisted from ever getting a visa and instantly deported. That is an example of threat of legal process. Other examples include institutionalizing you or threats of institutionalization, and also telling you things like they are the ones that are supposed to put you back on a plane if you don't want to work for them anymore. And when I say put you back on a plane, I mean send you back to your home country, and they have to personally put you on the plane to send you back home. It is important to know that there is relief if you as a worker has experienced any of these issues. We have gotten this for our clients, and it is well worth it. Our clients are reunited with their families, they get their work permit and a path to the green card. So we're here to help, and once again, Thanks so much for joining me. I hope this video was helpful. Make sure you like, subscribe, because that's how we can continue to empower immigrants to pursue relief that will make life better for them. Until next time, take care.